Thank you, Ryan. That's actually a pretty cool thing. Would you guys like to share a little bit? Kayla and Harrison have a little bit to share about some pretty cool stuff.
Hello, I'm with Ryan. I don't really like speaking in front of people. Even though I used to be in theater, not really sure how that works out, but.
Hey everybody, good afternoon. My name is Harrison O'Connor. This is Kayla. We run Legacy Tree Company here in Albuquerque. We just wanted to talk to you all about a panel discussion that actually happens on a more or less monthly basis. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So as a way to give back to our community, we've decided to host panel discussions, and I think we've done 4 so far. So we have Brian Soar, Graham Davis, Joran Veers. We also have guests that come to speak. I think next month we're having John Ball actually come and work with us and be part of our panel discussion. But it's just a way for people in our industry to ask questions and work with people who know the answers. And if they don't know the answers, they know the people who do know. And so we stream that on Zoom. So if you'd like to be a part of it, you can come and find me, give me your email address, and we can send you the Zoom link. And that's, again, on a monthly basis.
Yeah, so we're going to be posting, that email on the screen. I'm emceeing that, and then, like Kayla said, we have 2 board-certified master arborists, and then 2 of our 3 regular panelists are going to be joining us for the last panel of the afternoon, so stick around and watch that. But the whole purpose of this was to create a safe environment where employers, arborists, tree workers could come and ask questions and say, we don't know, because I think everybody in here can relate to that uncomfortable feeling of really not knowing what to do and not having the expertise to turn to. So that's the purpose of this, and you all can Zoom in with your crew and bring your questions, and it's just the whole purpose of this is to build community, family, and elevate the standard. That's what we're calling it, elevate the standard monthly panel discussion. Look out for that email, and we look forward to seeing you.
And again, it's not just for arborists. So we have people who come from the nursery industry. We also have people who come from, landscape industry. So we're all a team, and we all have to work together. And so it's not just for certified arborists or people who prune trees. So yeah, hope to see everybody there.
That's a good example of partners in chlorophyll, so we love it. And John's going to come back up here and share with us more about insects. This is great. And remember, after break, there's going to be an incredible panel discussion, and the questions that have been submitted so far are good questions. So thank you all that have submitted them, and John, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you. So to go along with the theme of this conference, our meeting is drought. So today I'm going to be talking about tree health and how drought and bark beetles kind of interact to affect our forests. So there's a lot of different definitions of drought out there. You have the more technical period of unusually persistent dry weather that persists long enough to cause serious problems such as tree stress and or mortality. A more general one, shortage of water that is driven by an imbalance between supply and demand. But regardless, it's a complex phenomenon, okay? It's not like a hurricane moving through an area and causing tree damage or a tornado. Complex phenomenon. And there's several indices that are out there to really kind of bring that phenomenon into something we can understand, such as the Palmer Drought Index. There's 4 types: meteorological, so that's kind of more of the weather patterns and the climate patterns. when those are affected by drought. Hydrological, that's when the surface water, the groundwater is affected. Agricultural, that's when crops become affected, probably trees as well. And socioeconomic, that's when people are actually affected by the drought. There's a lot of literature out here in regards to how trees affect, or how drought affects tree health and affects in bark beetles, kind of the interactions there. You know, changes in tree physiology, how that weakens the tree defenses to bark beetle attack, the observed and anticipated impacts of drought on forest insects and disease, bark beetle caused mortality in drought-affected ponderosa pine landscapes in Arizona, and a global overview of drought and heat-induced tree mortality, which the emerging risk to forest with that. So, and this is only just, very few of the large body of literature that's out there on how drought affects trees and how that interacts with bark beetles. So currently, right now, this is on the y-axis, we have percent of New Mexico in whatever stage of drought. Along the X, we have the year 2000 to 2023, so going back 23 years. As you can see, we've had periods of extreme drought with intermittent periods of very little to no drought. But this definitely after a lot of the drought, when it's chronic, when it's there for a while, when it's here in the state for a while, we start seeing increased bark beetle activity, which means mortality caused by those bark beetles. So how does drought affect trees? It decreases its growth. So it undergoes photosynthetic changes. It causes embolisms or air bubbles within the tracheids. So when there's air bubbles in those tracheids, basically water is stopped. The movement of water and nutrients is stopped by that. So that's drought causes these embolisms. Leaf scorch and leaf loss. This is something we've seen across the state on a landscape scale over the last couple of years, especially in ponderosa pine. Greater seed production, so trees that are stressed, whether by drought or other means, you'll see them try to put that bumper crop on so they can reproduce and get their progeny out there before they die. Secondary attacks by insects and pathogens. I'll talk about this later. Decreased resin and secondary defensive compounds. And then the main thing here is these drought-stressed trees are emitting higher concentration of volatile chemicals, VOCs. Trees emit ethanol, alpha and beta pinene when they're stressed. And these are things that the bark beetles with their tiny little antennae can pick up over great distances. And the way trees are thinned in the management of those trees afterwards, the management of that slash, that material left over, how that is managed can really play a role in how a stand may be affected by bark beetle activity. So when trees are drought stressed, they start giving off higher concentrations of the VOCs. The bark beetles, from a long distance away or maybe even a short distance away, they detect these chemicals. Bark beetles have very poor vision. Basically, they can see silhouettes. So they smell these VOCs, they hone in on that, and then they start landing with their visual cues. With that kind of silhouette, they land on the trees and then initiate attack. And this was something that was brought up in during my last presentation, heat effects on trees. Well, heat increases the transpiration of trees via increased evaporative demand. So the atmosphere needs moisture, so it pulls moisture from the soil layer and from trees themselves. And you can see here in this graphic that the Southwest basically is an area that has changed. The reds are worse. and the cooler colors are better for atmospheric thirst. So the atmosphere has changed over between 1980 and 2020 to where the Southwest has a greater demand of atmospheric thirst. So it accelerates the water being drawn from the land surface or trees into the atmosphere. Bark beetles. I touched on bark beetles a little bit earlier. Going to go deeper into bark beetles. So these are insects that live and reproduce within the inner bark, phloem, and cambium layers. Okay, they don't drill into the wood of the tree. Those would be wood borers like longhorn borers, metallic wood boring beetles. So these are actually just living in the cambium phloem layer underneath the bark. Most species colonize dead, dying, damaged, or stressed trees. They don't like a tree that's healthy because they can't overwhelm the tree defenses. So they like ones that are a little bit stressed. The dendroctonous species and dendroctonous, such as mountain pine beetle, round-headed pine beetle, southwestern pine beetle, Douglas fir beetle, they attack healthy trees, but something underlying is going on, whether it's a root disease, drought stress, something like that. So even though they may look healthy and lush, there may be some underlying factors there. They generally kill more forests, more trees every year than any other mortality agent, including wildfire. And we have a graph down there. So this is looking at years 2016 to 2010. As you can see where I've highlighted here, that's years where bark beetles kill more trees than wildfire killed more trees. Most partner with symbiotic fungi. So these guys bring a fungi with them for their natal tree, so the tree that they were born in. They will leave that tree with symbiotic fungi. They either carry it on their exoskeleton or in special pouches within their exoskeleton called mycangia. And basically, you can think of this symbiotic fungi as kind of like a multivitamin. They bring it with them because trees are not very nutrient rich. So they bring this fungi with them that helps kind of supplement their vitamin minerals. And it also for food, much like a multivitamin, and then it helps overwhelm tree defenses. It can get into the vascular system of the tree, into the xylem, into those tracheids, and just stuff them up, and it helps overwhelm the tree's natural defense system. So there's 3 levels of bark beetle populations: latent or endemic. So that's very few beetles. Basically, that's what always is going on in a forest, even though you might not see any trees, or you might see one tree or something attacked and killed. There's always going to be bark beetles out there. Bark beetles are like all the pine beetles that I'm talking about today. They're native, so they're supposed to be here. They're nature's thinning agents. They're nature's foresters. Intermediate, also known as incipient epidemic. This is kind of the middle stage where there's a few infestation spots. Most species rely on dead, dying, stressed, unhealthy, damaged trees during this phase. And this is what we see here in New Mexico a lot. We see that phase right there where there's pockets of mortality here and there. The Forest Service does aerial surveys every year where we're flying above the national forests and some state and private lands. We survey about 13 million acres in the state every year to monitor trends, and this is what we see. We see this intermediate stage because of drought conditions. And then there's outbreak, aka epidemic. Massive population buildup, many trees damaged, many trees killed. In the early 2000s here in New Mexico, this is what happened in the early 2010s as well. So we do see this, but we only see it primarily in pinon. We really haven't seen a mass die-off event like mountain pine beetle caused up in Colorado with lodgepole pine and throughout the western U.S., really, other than New Mexico. We don't have a lot of mountain pine beetle here in the state. It's pretty rare. So there's 2 major bark beetle genera. These genera of bark beetles. One's dendroctonous. Species in the genus can be identified by the host species they attack, and I'll go into a couple of the gallery patterns here in a minute. The Dendroctonus, dendro, tree or shrub, woody plant, and Octonus killer, so tree killers. They attack and infest apparently healthy trees. There may be some underlying things we can't see, whether it's defensive compounds are low. There's root diseases going on. That is the most economically and ecological significant species affecting forest ecosystems. In the southeastern U.S., it's southern pine beetle, because they have a huge timber industry there. In Colorado and northward, it was mountain pine beetle. So we have these things going on. Not too much here in the south with Dendroctonus for those epidemic or those outbreak stage. So death of the host is often a requirement for successful brood production, so they have to overwhelm that last bullet point there. They have to overcome tree defenses of these healthy, vigorous hosts. Many beetles must attack within a short time, 1 to 3 days. So you need hundreds or thousands of beetles attacking this tree. And the female here is the colonizing sex. She attacks the tree. She produces a pheromone, an aggregation. I talked about anti-aggregation pheromone with verbenone. Well, once she starts attacking the tree, she'll release an aggregation pheromone that'll draw in males and other females as well. So that's how they aggregate, and that's how they attack and kill a tree. Ips, the species can also be identified by the gallery pattern and the host species attacked. These are called engraver beetles because they actually engrave into the xylem. They engrave into the sapwood themselves, so they engrave a little bit. And I'll show you a picture in a minute. Attack and infest weakened, dying, or recently felled conifers and fresh logging debris. This is a big one for those of you that are doing a thinning project on clients' lands. And I'll talk about how to treat that logging debris later. The male is the colonizing sex here of the ips. So the male goes in, sends out the aggregation pheromone, and everybody else comes. Population buildup in response to natural and man-made events. The pinyon ips is an ip species. So, drought in the early 2000s, that was the inciting factor for that. Windstorms can be another one. So you have a wind event like straight line winds, knocks down a bunch of spruce trees up in the high elevations, and you'll have spruce ips come and attack those still green trees while they're laying over, many of them attached still by the roots. Wildfire and thinning operations as well. We see a lot of Douglas fir beetle activity around recent fire scars. So around the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire, we expect to see an uptick in Douglas fir beetle and those ip species that attack ponderosa pine. So here's some illustrations of Dendroctonus and ips galleries. Various shapes of galleries for Dendroctonus, it depends. Of course, if you're looking at a spruce, you could probably know it's going to be either a spruce beetle or a spruce ips. And you can tell the difference by removing the bark and looking underneath the bark. Southwestern pine beetle, this used to be western pine beetle, but they did some genetic analysis, and it's actually a different species than the western. So now it's southwestern pine beetle here in the state, and then there's Arizona. But I heard it, when it was western pine beetle, kind of spaghetti western. They kind of looks like spaghetti thrown down on a plate. So they have these meandering galleries. And I want to point out in spruce beetle and Douglas fir beetle, those little laterally mining or horizontal mining, those are the larval galleries. So the female's laying it in that, female is laying it in this egg gallery right here, the eggs, and when those eggs hatch, the larvae mine horizontally or laterally from the egg gallery. You don't notice any in the southwestern pine beetle. Those are all egg galleries because the larvae mine into the inner bark. So they don't mine kind of like the other species do. In Douglas fir beetle, again, the middle one is the egg gallery, and the larvae spread out horizontally. Ips have that have a Y, X, or I-shaped gallery, and you can see they're called engraver beetles, and you can see the scoring there in the xylem of the tree. And another distinguishing characteristic is ips will not leave frass in the egg galleries. You can see all that frass or that wood-boring dust kind of on the edges there. Dendroctonus will have frass in their egg galleries, but IPs will not. So that's another distinguishing feature. So how do trees defend themselves since they can't run and hide? They're stuck in one place. How do they defend themselves? With physical and chemical defenses. The physical component is resin. Okay? If a tree's not well watered, though, it can produce very little to no resin. So it's dependent on water availability, whether it can produce that resin. And basically, right now I'm talking about pine species more than I am hardwood. And it's a barrier that helps flush out bark beetles and seal wounds. We looked at those pitch tubes earlier. You know, the tree was being successful on some of the attack sites to try to pitch out or suffocate and kill that insect, and other sites it wasn't on that tree. And then they have secondary defensive compounds. These are things you cannot see, but they are components of resin. And some of them are monoterpenes. They have insecticidal properties. Diterpene and stilbene inhibit the growth of that symbiotic fungi that they bring with them too. And limonene, it also has insecticidal properties, and it's also found just naturally in the phloem. When the beetles start getting attacked, or even sometimes when their neighbors get attacked, because trees, we know now, can communicate through their roots, through mycorrhizal fungi. Yep, and so we know that they can communicate, so maybe when one of its neighbors are getting attacked, it sends a signal to one of its neighbors to, something like, I'm getting attacked, you might want to increase your defensive compounds. Well, how can you help protect trees against drought, heat, and bark beetles? And this is for Pinus edulis and Pinus ponderosa, so more of the pines, since we have a lot more activity in bark beetles, bark beetles in the pines. And I harped on this on the last one. Properly water your trees in times of drought. Generally, what I would tell people, if they don't want to look up a nice chart or something, just water once a month if no precipitation occurs during that month. At the end of that month, if you haven't got any rainfall, water your tree. Soaker hose, similar slow drip devices, whatever. But, you got to target your high-value trees because you can't, somebody with an acre of pinyon trees can't really water every one of those trees. Water at the ideal watering zone. So we have a nice graphic there showing you the drip line. Generally, we say the drip line is where you need to water, but it can kind of spread out there where all those feeder roots are. So a foot or two in from the drip line, a couple of feet out from the drip line. Water berms can be detrimental. You see this water berm, that can compact down and almost become concrete-like and smother the roots of that growing tree. So I always recommend just mulching instead. Get you a nice layer of mulch on there instead of these water berms. And as we're all most of us in here, some of us in here are probably homeowners, and we have those in-ground watering systems. They can be really hard to move as the tree grows. That takes a lot of time and effort, so that's something you might want to think about when you're putting in something like that, to have you some put in that will be available when the tree grows, as the tree's growing. And you can overwater pinyon and juniper, so just be sure that your clients or people you're working with know that yes, you can you can overwater a pinyon and juniper. Insecticide sprays applied to bark in late winter, early spring. Again, I talked about this earlier, but carbaryl, permethrin, and others, you got to apply about every 1 to 2 years. And there's off-target effects through drift to other insects and animals. Systemic insecticides, efficacy is questionable. Tree needs to be well watered for it to uptake. The temperature needs to be right. So there's some issues with that. Emamectin benzoate, so triage in boxers, the trade names, offers protections for about 2 years, minimal off-target effects. And there was a question, I got a question saying, what about pollen? Yes, imidacloprid can translocate to the flowers and to the pollen, but honeybees don't nectar, they don't collect pollen from pinyon trees or pine trees. So, that's really more for row crop and stuff like that. So So not really concerned with, but I'm sure there are some things that do eat the pollen. So, just keep that in mind that there can be some off-target effects after it translocates to certain parts of the tree for beneficial insects or animals. Thin trees on property, you have more resources for the remaining trees once you thin trees. Bark beetle pheromones dissipate quicker when you thin a property. When it's a very dense stand, not a lot of wind flow can get through that stand. So those bark beetle pheromones kind of swirl within that stand and aren't blown away. So if you open up the stand, that wind can get in and blow those pheromones away quicker. And generally, trees go through shock for a few years following thinning. There's a lot of times that I went out to a landowner's property, and they were kind of horrified at the after effects, and the trees looked poorly. But over time, those trees will bounce back and have more resources available to them as they're post-thinning. Best time to prune or fell trees, I kind of mentioned this last presentation. Again, Pinus edulis and Pinus ponderosa, so pinyon and ponderosa pine. Cut, thin, and prune during bark beetle inactive period, which is October to February. When I was in state forestry, that was kind of not feasible during the winter and higher elevation things where there's a lot of snow. But if it's a lower elevation, not a lot of snow on the ground, definitely good to do if you're thinning in a pine forest. It's a strong suggestion, but not mandatory. Make sure to talk with your client or whoever you're working with to really kind of go through what could happen if you do not thin during October to February. If thin during the active period, don't leave large diameter material on the ground more than 30 days. This was an Ipsa-tacked felled pinyon up at the Glorieta camps near Santa Fe. It was thinned earlier in the year. This was May, and it had snowed that weekend. So there's snow on the ground. It's cold. However, the bark beetles are active. They start becoming active about March, April. So just be aware that if you do leave large diameter stuff out there, the Ips will attack this green material on the ground, and then they may emerge from that and attack residual trees that you've left after thinning. Why 30 days? Well, it's about 30 to 45 because that's the time that it takes the adult female to lay the egg and that egg to go through its life stages to an adult. So about 30 to 45 days. Account for other forest health issues or site features within the stand. I'll talk about that in a minute. And monitor tree health post-thinning. And make sure your clients know to reach back out to you if they see any indication of residual trees being attacked after that. And that's when you can go in and start removing those trees that have been attacked to try to get that population out of that stand of trees. So slash management recommendations. What should you do with all that material that's being cut? Generally slash in forestry is like the remaining limbs and stuff, but sometimes you have some larger bolts of wood or some larger diameter wood out there. And you can do these things. And I'll first say that during my time with state forestry, a lot of landowners did not like to do lop and scatter because they want to walk on their property, and if there's a lot of debris on the property that they step over, they have to step over or trip over or whatever, they just don't really like doing lop and scatter. So one of the big ones here is chipping. However, chipping initially releases very high levels of monoterpenes, so those volatile organic compounds that the bark beetles can pick up on, but they decline sharply over time. One study found a threefold increase in attacked trees and chip plots versus lop and scatter. We can see from this chart here, on the Y, we have the mean percentage of residual trees attacked by bark beetles. So the mean percentage of those trees that were left after thinning, how many of those got attacked by bark beetles, and then the treatment type. CS is chipping during the spring. CRS is chipping during the spring and raking, randomly dispersing those chips across the project area, and then raking, making sure that everything's raked about 2 feet from the root collar away from the tree. CF is chipping in the fall. CRF is chipping in the fall and randomly distributing the chips and raking. LS is lop and scatter in the spring, and lop and scatter. LF is lop and scatter in the fall, and untreated is doing nothing. As you can see, chipping in the spring or chipping in the fall, well, chipping in the spring and is significantly different than everything else besides chipping in the spring and raking away. So it didn't seem raking away from the trees did anything. Chipping in the fall, you had a significant difference. So, and that's what I recommend is if you're going to chip and you need to wait till about October, somewhere around there. There was a project area east of Santa Fe. They chipped in August, and by September, 70 of their trees had been attacked. 70 of their residual trees had been attacked by bark beetles because there was such a high level of monoterpenes in that project area that the beetles just came in and took out a lot of the residual or remaining trees. However, with chipping, there's no material left for bark beetles to colonize. Sometimes when we have large diameter stuff on the ground out there, they'll come in and attack that large diameter green material in the ground before attacking or not attacking residual trees at all. So if you do have something that they can come in and attack, they may just leave without attacking any of the residual trees. October to January only to chip, or if you are chipping in the middle of summer, it's fine, just chip it into a trailer and remove it each day or every couple of days. So that's an alternative is chip into a trailer and remove those. Lop and scatter, monoterpene release is slow and steady, so not really anything to call. Maybe it'll call some bark beetles in. Materials left on site may be colonized if it's big enough. We say anything over about a 3 or 4 inch diameter is good for colonization. They need a certain diameter, the bark beetles do, to make those galleries to rear their offspring. It may be safer than chipping or mastication during bark beetle active period, but again, not a lot of homeowners or land owners like to have lop and scatter or like to do lop and scatter. Mastication, so you get that big mastication machine in there, that drum masticator. It just chips up, you just roll it over a whole tree. It just kind of breaks it into larger parts. Monoterpene release there is somewhere in between chipping and lop and scatter. I've only seen a couple of purely mastication jobs done, but there were some attacked trees afterwards. And some of the material on site may be colonized since it's a little bit bigger material. Site features that may influence bark beetle activity. Dwarf mistletoe is a big one. So not only on top of drought, and I mentioned this earlier, do you have, the trees don't have much moisture to begin with, but then you have the dwarf mistletoe taking more water and nutrients away from the tree. Tree mortality can be 3 to 4 times higher than in uninfected stands. So stands that don't have any dwarf mistletoe at all, stands that have dwarf mistletoe have 3 to 4 times higher mortality than those uninfected stands. Bark beetles frequently attack heavily infected trees, especially during drought. Why? Because they're stressed out even more. They don't have that resin. They don't have much resin or any resin at all. Those defensive compounds are probably really low, those concentrations. And like I said earlier, dwarf mistletoe on pinyon and ponderosa. We do have dwarf mistletoe on other tree species in the state, but these are kind of the ones that really affect people the most. Aspect, is it a south-facing slope that's going to be hotter and drier? Is it a north-facing slope that's going to be wetter and cooler? So you got to take into account that. Elevation and latitude. So what elevation are you working at? Maybe it's an elevation that does have a good amount of snowpack every year, that has a little bit, more water seeping in to the ground. Latitude, are you working in the northern part of the state or the southern part of the state? And that's another good thing to bring up is that with our summers becoming warmer, they may emerge earlier in the year and they may be active later in the year. So their active period has been drawn out a little bit more due to temperature changes. And also there may be less mortality during the winter since we're having milder winters. Generally, it needs to get down in the negative numbers before we have any mortality to bark beetles caused by cold temperatures. And microclimate, microtopography, so you can see there on the south-facing slope, those drainages are going to be more moist and more cool than the non-drainages on that south-facing slope. And there's a forest health web map, the U.S. Forest Service and New Mexico Forestry Division. Like I said, we aerial survey the whole 13 million acres of the state. So you can, if you have a project area somewhere, you can go to our forest health web map and you can kind of check the surrounding areas. However, it is limited on state and private lands. We don't fly the whole state. We prioritize the national forests and the state and private land around there and some of the bigger land owners around the state. But there is good information on there about activity of bark beetles, defoliators, all that good stuff. What should you do with bark beetle infested trees? Number one, I always recommend number one, cut and remove the trees from the property promptly. Within 30 days, but sooner the better. This is the best choice, in my opinion. And take, somewhere, to a transfer station or somewhere without the same species of tree. You can fell the tree and immediately cut into 1 to 2 foot sections, more labor intensive. Try to remove as much bark as possible. Why? Because they live underneath that bark, and if you get rid of their habitat, they'll die sooner. The wood will dry out sooner. And you don't want to try to pile this stuff up because of that stuff on the interior of the pile will stay moist for a longer time and not dry out, and the bark beetles could colonize that. So, I say in a single layer, but just some way that you're not making a big pile of that, of those sections. Fell tree and immediately split into firewood. Again, even more laborious than the number 2 or number 1. And stack away from healthy trees and try to remove as much bark as possible to help it dry out. And there's this thing called solarization. Does covering bark beetle infested wood with plastic work? Well, this creates a greenhouse effect that warms up that area, and it does kill bark beetles. But there's issues. We all know that the springs in New Mexico are windy. Other periods of the year, other times of the year is windy too. So this plastic could flap up in the wind. That's given the bark beetles a place to escape. It's not coming to the right temperature to kill the beetles. And this looks like it was done with one tree. If you have multiple trees, you got to have a lot of plastic, and it takes a lot of time to do this, and it might not always work. So that's why I'm always going to recommend number 1, but certainly the other things could be done as well. That's what I have. Yeah.
As I already mentioned, I'm not a tree expert guy, but I know that the watering of our trees is a significant issue, getting that water where it's supposed to be at. What are some resources that we can point people towards, or even ourselves, to find the soil moisture content that, say, a pinon wants or a juniper wants? Because honestly, I didn't realize that you could overwater those two, especially in the desert. I figure they could use all the water they could get, but it makes sense. I just don't know where to find that information.
So I've seen something Marissa had before with watering regimes like that the city of Albuquerque put out. That is a nice chart that says what time of year and how often you should water. So that's out there. And I saw Marissa with that. So, but very general. I do recommend some people who are really into it to get a soil moisture meter. I think you would probably have to search somewhere to find what what that moisture meter needs to read for pinyon, ponderosa, whatever. So I think that's out there, but yeah, at certain times when people are really concerned about the regime and how much water their trees are getting. They don't want to overwater. They're really into watering their trees. I recommend getting a soil moisture meter. The good ones are very expensive though, but I think they're worth the investment when you're talking about, trees that are dying on your property. So, yes.
Okay, I have a question. Hi, my name is Matthew. I'm from Seeds of Wisdom, Santa Fe. My question is, what do you think about using the infected wood as biomass in a biomass generator?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's all good. Again, I wouldn't, if you're taking it to wherever that biomass generator is, make sure you're not stacking that up. If you're not using it immediately, make sure there's not pinyon on the property that's going to get infested or ponderosa.
So it'd be like an emergency spot, like an empty parking lot, like we could probably do this, and then do like a mobile biomass generator and tie it to the grid, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that
So
would be great.
You just recommend don't keeping it there too long and in the same vicinity as the same species?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you.
Raw.
Hello. Kind of a two-part question. Regarding, regarding the different protocols for cutting and slash management and such, this also ties into watering. I'm wondering if this would be mostly for urban management, but is there a calculation for the effects of just running a masticator and running thinning crews and such as to what that does to sort of the soil profile? And if there's a way to measure and kind of weigh that to make a decision onto the most effective approach. And then flip side, if there's any studies kind of looking to, especially for smaller parcels, pignons around homes, soil remediation through like ground covers or what's called remeadowing for water retention, pollinator support, et cetera, and how that may directly tie into what we call an issue at hand for bark beetle.
Yeah, so the first question about how thinning or whatever affects the soil profile or soil health,
Yeah.
right? I do know that, once you open up the stand, that sun intensity is going to be hitting, that sun's going to be hitting areas it didn't hit before because that canopy's gone. It can have an effect on mycorrhizal fungi. It can bake the fungi. That's why I said they go through a shock after a couple of years. It takes time for that mycorrhizal fungi to adjust and rebound as well. Chipping, lop and scatter, and mastication is all good for erosion control, to leave it on the property. So, but I think, as far as like meadow restoration or having wildflowers come back, chipping's probably not the best because it really kind of, a nice thick mat across the property, where maybe lop and scatter or mastication would help, would give, would limit erosion, would kind of keep some of that moisture on the project area or whatever you're dealing with, and gives it some area to come up in between all that lop and scatter or that mastication work. So, chipping I don't think is the best for meadow restoration or having grasses and wildflowers come back because it forms such a thick mat in some areas. So, yeah, but again, people don't like lap and scatter that much, and I think that's what I have for that question. I don't know if I answered all the.
It wasn't a great question, well, phrased-wise, but I appreciate it. But just to be clear then, you're currently in your slides or your body of like information, you don't have like a study or any research that specifically looks at kind of soil health and how that directly impacts like, reinfestation from beetles or current and basically understanding that cryptoforms and like especially pinyon juniper ecosystems are quite delicate.
They are, and and there's a lot. We have a lot of poor soils here, and even around Santa Fe, there's different soil types, and even just the limiting layer to solid bedrock or something changes a lot around Santa Fe, that can in itself have an impact on tree health, the amount that the roots can spread and can branch out. But I think there is probably some literature out there looking at soil health and how that may affect bark beetle activity, but nothing's really coming to my mind right now.
Sorry, then just one more. So if you just had to say, like, at times, do we have a tool to gauge, is it safer to do no thinning or to thin this based on all the things, that you're weighing, like monoterpene release, is there a way to look at a property and with confidence talk to a client and say, this is kind of a no-go, or we definitely should go in there? And I'm going to step away from the microphone.
Okay, it's variable. It's a lot upon the factors that I already touched on. It's a lot on the factors that I already touched on. Some of that's microclimate aspect, but there's no real way to say, yes, that stand's going to get thinned, and then yes, that stand's going to get attacked by bark beetles. I've seen stands that have been thinned, all that large diameter material laid out there during a drought period, it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and nothing got attacked. The material on the ground, the residual trees, and then again, I've seen a stand that you would think that you didn't see any attacked trees around at all before the thinning, and nothing happened. So there's no way to say yes or no that that's going to happen. It's very hard. I would say, though, if you do see a lot of bark beetle activity in the area, there's a good chance that you might get some residual trees attacked just because there's a high population of beetles in the area. Yes?
As far as hardwood trees that have to be removed because of pest infestations, do you have any feelings about the mulch and using the bark or wood mulch, et cetera, in that? Are there some that it's okay and some that it's not?
I would say generally it's okay with all hardwoods. They do have monoterpenes, they do have volatile chemicals, but the bark beetles that attack those trees don't really behave the same way as pine infesting bark beetles. So my thoughts on chipping hardwood trees, go for it even in the summer. And juniper, that's something that you can prune any time of year. I'm just talking about not pruning pinyon, not pruning ponderosa during the summer, or felling if you can help it.
Thank you. We have another question from Linda online. I've heard that once an Ips-infested tree is dying or dead, that beetles have already left the tree and it's no longer a threat to others. Please address.
Okay, so it depends. Say the tree's attacked early spring, right after they emerge, so March, April. That tree is going to probably have beetles in it until 3 or 4 months later. A good way to tell is to go up to the tree, remove the bark, and look for living beetles. You can also look on the tree for exit holes. When the beetles attack the tree, they don't go right in through the bark plate. They kind of find areas of least resistance, so they go behind the bark plate and they enter in. So it's really hard to tell where they enter, as you can see from pitch tubes and boring dust. But when they emerge from the tree, they emerge everywhere, anywhere and everywhere. So you can go up to a tree, look for exit holes. Just because there's exit holes doesn't mean that there's still some beetles in it, but at least some have started emerging. You can remove the bark. You can look for the beetles. And if you remove a couple of sections of bark, no beetles, there's probably no beetles in there at all. Once the tree has no needles at all, there's no more beetles in there. So you see a skeleton tree or a tree with very little needles, no bark beetles in there at all. Say a bark beetle attacks a tree in the fall, like around or late summer, like August or September. Those are going to overwinter until the next spring. So you're going to have beetles emerging from that tree probably until the middle of summer, something like that. So it really depends, but the best way to check is to remove the bark of that tree if it's actively being infested or has actively been infested by bark beetles. You know, you need to look for those other signs and symptoms so you're just not hacking into a client or a homeowner's tree that may be okay, but make sure you see those signs and symptoms, the brown crown, the boring dust, the pitch tubes, those types of things. And there's also predators and parasitoids you'll see on the tree, like little clarid beetles running up and down, these really crazy looking wasps that inject their eggs in the tree. So you can also see those things on the tree as well to tell that it's infested.